Thank you for coming to this session. We are going to try and make it a bit interactive, which might be a bit challenging later on, but I'm sure you'll live with us. My name's Stuart, I'm from Department of Education, and Susanna will also be doing this with me, and she'll be doing most of the talking. I'm just doing the introduction bit. And what we want to talk to you today about is research priorities. We want to get a view from everyone here about what the key gaps and questions are in education. And we're going to put it in a bit of context. So we're going to tell you a little bit about why we're interested as DFE and sort of where it comes from. So quickly we're going to go through evidence-based teaching, which is the sort of reason I'm here. So I'm a policy person that works in teacher quality. To sort of explain the context for the kind of research priorities and questions approach, which is then we want to have a bit of discussion with you about. And then we'll try and do a bit of roundup this on the next step. So how are we going to take forward the kind of conversation from today and what our plan is going forward. So, evidence-based teaching and policy. So, our interest, the department's interest started about 2 years ago now. And the picture that you can't see, that was there originally, was a picture of Bengali because he was one of the reasons why we started talking about this. So ministers asked Bengali to do a bit of work for us looking at how the department used evidence. And he said, actually I'm probably more interested in how teachers in the system use evidence. So he started us off with a thing like that. At the same time we did a kind of analytical review where we looked at how the department used evidence. And we wondered out loud internally with lots of external people about whether there was a prize to be gained from better use of evidence. Now you guys are all the confidence, you know that we think there's a prize, and you guys generally think there's a prize, so that's kind of the bit of what we did. It's just worth talking a bit about our thinking and how we got to where we are, or at least we thought it was. So we talked to lots of different people, and pretty much everyone had a different definition of evidence-based teaching. And it included bits of individuals understanding evidence base, bits of programs, which I think if anyone here was for James's sort of earlier, he talked about the kind of policy and programs and practice examples, all of that stuff. And we basically came up with our own working definition, which was about individuals using their own teaching expertise and the most up-to-date systematic evidence to inform their practice. And a kind of challenge, how would you know if that was achieved, was that all teachers, and actually we didn't really mean teachers, decision makers, but all teachers could justify based on logic and evidence their practice, not because Ofsted told them to do it or DFE told them to do it, because there was a kind of logical chain. So from that kind of starting point, we thought about a sort of system that what would we need to do to help support this to kind of happen. And there's the three bits of it. So this will be familiar to some people, but possibly not, I think, by others. So the first bit's the sort of school bit, which is a bit most people will be familiar with. So how do you promote research for use in schools? And there's various models for this. There's the EF had a kind of 5-part, 5-stage model. Our kind of simpler version was a 3-step one. But basically, how do you help teachers access evidence? How do you help them use it to plan they do, and then how do you help people evaluate whether that's working or not? That's kind of the first bit. The second bit is, well, as part of that process, you need to have a system, everyone pulling together to mean that the right evidence is available and accessible. So it's the right quality, it's on the right areas, and it helps people do what they want to do with it. And that's the bit we'll come back to in a second. And the third thing, just to kind of complete this, was we could tell from the fact that the department's been interested in this before, that lots of other people have been interested in this before, and from talking to health and medicine and the parallels, that even where you have ideal circumstances, so you have really interested practitioners that are really interested in research, you have research that's available, it doesn't then follow that practice changes. So some of that, some of the most commonly cited examples of that are like hand washing in medicine. So most people thought it was a good idea to stop people dying, most people knew the evidence base said you should wash your hands, but then people didn't do it. So we said, well, there's probably a need for some support, some people with expertise about how to change that from kind of research into practice. And that's some of the reason why we worked with the EF, and again James and Lee talked about this earlier, why we invested in the research use round, to try and generally build the evidence base about how to do that well, because basically we don't really know yet. So that's our kind of 3-bit approach. And the one we really want to focus on today is the one we probably found to be sort of the most difficult. Because on one hand, the easy answer is, the EEF are great, they've got quite a lot of money, and they are really trying to help develop that evidence base. But they're not the only people funding research, and they account for actually quite a small proportion of the number of people thinking about doing their own research. So we were thinking about, well, how do you help the system as a whole do the right sorts of things? And this is where we came up with a kind of how we could help do that, and so that research is has more impact for practitioners, but also has more impact for policy too. So this is where we sort of changed our approach. I'm going to I hope that's a neat segue into Susanna's bit.
I'm Susanna Greenwood, so I'm a social researcher in the Department of Education, so I work with Stuart, who's a policy maker, and where our work links is through our focus on research and evidence, our interest in how it's generated, how it's used and implemented, and then what impact it has. And part of moving towards a more evidence-based system, the department itself is changing to become more transparent and collaborative about the way it commissions research, and also how it can foster more of a sense of shared ownership about the evidence base on all sorts of issues that spread across the sector to schools, colleges and academics and the research community, and also the social care sector, which our department also has responsibility for. And there's a recognition that the department needs to understand more about research that's going on, what's gone before, what's the good evidence base, what does it consist of, what evidence is being collected at the moment, what research is going on at the moment that can help us join up with others and others to join up to talk and discuss about what the research priorities for education and children's services and how best to fill the gaps. So to kickstart this discussion, we've published a suite of research priorities and question papers. Now one, the teaching paper actually was published last year in June, but the bulk of the papers were published a couple of weeks ago on the 13th of March. And this slide shows a summary of those paper titles. They're not in any particular order of importance or size or anything like that. The only thing to note about the top 4 is that they're outlined in bold, and that's because we've picked them out as some of the papers that we're going to discuss in a moment and hopefully get you to input on your ideas and thoughts on those. And the other one to note is the one in the right-hand corner, which is dotted red one, which is the 16 to 19 provision, which is just being drafted and will shortly be published. Now, they are set out in those areas, and we totally recognise that there's lots of overlaps and interconnections between those papers, and we're working hard to make sure that those interconnections are recognised and worked on. And what they are, in fact, is more a reflection of how our department is organised internally rather than anything else necessarily. So things like adoption, children in care, social work and child protection are very, very interlinked and almost could be one paper itself. They're not hugely detailed papers, but they're quite ambitious in their reach, in that they're about research for both policy and practice. And they're not meant to be about just what we think are the priorities, they're meant to be about starting a discussion about what the priorities are, what you think the priorities are, what you think the gaps are, and forging forward with a discussion together with the sector. And they're not detailed, so they're quite high level. I think that's one thing that we need to recognise with them. There is some policy context, there is some research context, and then we've picked out some key questions that we think are important under each of these topics. So what's the purpose of the papers? Well, we want to help improve the evidence base on which policy decisions are made, and we want to improve the sharing and use of evidence through a better dialogue with the sector, with better dialogue with academics, with better dialogue with practitioners, and we want to improve those links with others and between those groups too. So So it's not just us to others, it's groups within that I've described. And through that, we want to develop a more cohesive research strategy so that the research we commission in the department is fully linked up with the research that's already going on or has already taken place, that's a good, robust evidence base, and therefore supportive value for money for the department's research. And ultimately, we want to encourage the development and use of evidence to be increasingly driven and owned by the sector. So I'm going to hand over to Stu now, who's going to talk us through our breakout discussions.
So what we're hoping to get you to do is to kind of take a bit of time to look at the 4 areas that are identified on the class slide. That's school behaviour, attendance, SEN, teachers and teaching, and the one I can't see, and I can't remember, proof of premium. Get your ideas on kind of, is the overall approach we've just described a helpful one, a good one, bad one, different? Are the questions, we've only selected a couple of the kind of key ones, but we will signpost kind of a whole suite of documents if you particularly if you want to comment there from length. But some of the key questions, are they the sorts of things that you find interesting, relevant, whatever else? And are they things that you think we should be focusing on, or that there's a massive gap on? And it's quite helpful to get a balance of kind of detail on the high level, because from kind of policy perspective, we often start from the high level end, so it's quite helpful to get after that. And then the final thing is, if you know about research that's happening, so with a teacher academic in the room that fits some of those questions or those gaps and might be in that area, it's useful for us to know, so we can join it back up again. So we're going to do about 15-20 minutes on this. There's the 4 flip charts, so we'll move some of them about a bit, so there's a bit more spread about. There's a selection of post-its here, which we'll hand out, so if we can kind of have a bit of a free-for-all, we'll try and let you know when some sensible times are, so if you get stuck on one, you've got a bit of time to move around. It's not the perfect room for it, but I think we can probably cope given the numbers. And then afterwards, we'll try and give an opportunity for to explain what we're doing, but also for any questions on the overall approach, or you can ask about government things about evidence-based teaching, pretty much anything for the last wrap-up bit, and we'll do our best to answer you. Is that okay? Relative nods. Great. Thank you very much.